In November of 1936, the fate of the Spanish Civil War arguably came down to a single week of fighting. Nationalist forces were at the very gates of Madrid, and instead of a protracted siege, they gambled everything on a direct, frontal assault right through the city's university campus. Today, we're going to break down the military decisions and the absolutely brutal combat of that pivotal week.
Now, this analysis is grounded in the incredibly detailed work of Spanish Army Colonel F.J. Victor Rodrigo. So we'll be approaching this from a strictly military and technical standpoint, really digging into the key operational and tactical decisions that determine the final outcome.
So here's our agenda. First, we'll examine the strategic dilemma facing the attackers. Then, we'll look at the absolutely critical crossing of the Manzanares River. After that, the logistical nightmare known as the Footbridge of Death. Then, we'll dive into the brutal building-to-building combat, and finally, we'll cover the strategic decision at Leganés that brought the assault to an end.
All right, let's get right into it. The entire operation was a high-risk gamble from the start, and you have to understand, the Nationalist High Command was acutely aware of this reality. You see, General Franco knew his expeditionary army was far too small for a conventional assault on a city the size of Madrid. His forces were stretched thin, at the end of a very long and fragile supply line with dangerously exposed flanks. The whole plan really was predicated on the assumption that the Republican forces just wouldn't have the operational skill to exploit these critical weaknesses. So let's look at the opposing forces. On one hand, the attackers were veterans, battle-hardened troops from the Army of Africa. But they were suffering from serious attrition after months of hard fighting. On the other hand, the defenders had transformed. They were no longer just a disorganized militia. Their resolve had stiffened, and crucially, they were being reinforced. New mixed brigades were forming, the first international brigades were arriving, and superior Soviet equipment, especially tanks and aircraft, was beginning to tip the scales.
Everything, and I mean everything, hinged on forcing a crossing of the Manzanares River. What happened on November 15th would be the decisive moment of the entire battle.
The first attempt was a direct frontal assault on the Puente Nuevo, the new bridge. At 10 o'clock in the morning, the attack went in, but it immediately slammed into a wall of ferocious resistance. Anti-tank guns took out the lead Nationalist tanks. The assault stalled, and then, just before noon, Republican engineers blew the bridge, completely shutting down that main axis of advance.
So, with the bridge gone, the plan had to adapt on the fly. At around 4 in the afternoon, after a heavy bombardment, veteran Moroccan regulars from the Tabor of Alhucemas just waded across the river itself. And against the odds, they made it, carving out a small, incredibly vulnerable bridgehead on the other side and seizing the first buildings of the university.
You know, the Republican Chief of Staff, Vicente Rojo, really captured the shock of this moment. His words here are a stunning admission. He's saying the defenders had numerical and material superiority right at that point of attack. The fact that a small attacking force managed to break through wasn't just a testament to their skill, it was a grave tactical failure by the defense.
Okay, so the bridgehead was established, but it was an island, completely cut off, and the problem of supplying and reinforcing it became an immense, almost insurmountable tactical challenge. Under the cover of darkness, engineers managed to throw a single pontoon footbridge across the river, but look at its location. It was a death trap. It was completely exposed to flanking machine gun fire from Republican positions to the south, not to mention from the fortified high ground on the opposite bank. And here it is. This is the bridge itself. It very quickly earned its infamous name, La Pasarela de la Muerte, the Footbridge of Death. And you can see why. This one fragile structure was the only artery for every single soldier, every bullet, and every casualty moving into or out of the university city. Crossing this thing was, quite literally, a life-or-death lottery. All resupply, all reinforcements, all evacuations had to be done in the dark, and even then, it was just a mad sprint across what they called a crossroads of bullets. The only tactic was to run and hope the gunners on the other side were reloaded. Now, once they were across the river, the nature of the battle transformed completely. This was no longer a war of maneuver. It became a brutal, close-quarters war of attrition, fought for every single room of every single building. The advance was just this slow, grinding process, measured in meters. On the 16th, they took the Casa de Velázquez and the School of Agronomy. But the 17th, that was the bloodiest single day of the battle, with key buildings being taken at an enormous cost. By the 19th, the objective had even shifted to just securing the flank of the footbridge, which shows you how critical that single point had become.
The fighting on the 17th was particularly savage. This had devolved into a pure meat grinder. We're talking bayonets, hand grenades, and dynamite, fought room by room, floor by floor. Every inch of ground was paid for in blood on both sides.
To really understand the reality of this combat, you have to look at the numbers. The Republicans threw over 11,000 men, 11 brigades, into the fight just to contain a nationalist force of maybe 3,000 at most. The fighting grew so desperate that mine warfare began, with engineers using dynamite to simply collapse buildings on top of the enemy. And at the center of it all, the Hospital Clinico became this charnel house, a symbol of the brutal stalemate, with floors and wings changing hands for days on end.
By November 23rd, the advance had completely ground to a halt. The attackers had reached their culminating point. The operational limit was hit, and this forced a critical strategic decision.
With the front line static and his elite troops bled white, Franco convened a meeting of his top generals at Leganés. The conclusion was unavoidable. The frontal assault had failed. It had to be abandoned. The war for Madrid would now shift to a new strategy, one of encirclement and attrition.
So what was the official military reasoning? Well, General Solihuet's assessment really boiled it down to three core factors. First, the sheer numbers, a manifest inequality of forces. The attackers were simply too few. Second, the enemy's capability. The Republicans, now reinforced by international troops and their Soviet gear, used the urban terrain masterfully. And third, the entire tactical situation was untenable. The whole assault depended on a tiny, precarious bridgehead with dangerously weak and exposed flanks.
And that brings us to what is probably the most accurate summary of this entire battle. Ultimately, the defense of Madrid wasn't a miracle, as the propaganda would have you believe. It was the direct, logical military consequence of a very determined, high-quality attacking force hitting its operational limit against a defender that was numerically superior, increasingly well-equipped, and fighting fiercely on its home ground. It was simply a matter of military reality.